Well, thanks very much for inviting me to address you. Chile is an enormously impressive society. You're very obviously the role model that the rest of Latin America looks to. And indeed, you'll look to in other parts of the world as well. You've made enormous strides over the last 3 decades. So it's a pleasure to talk to you. It's also a particular pleasure to talk to the business community, because I'm going to argue that the business community is strategically enormously important. So I'm going to be talking about sustainable development. And sustainability has 2 fundamental components. One is environmental, and the other is social. And both are essential. If we don't have a sustainable environment, things go very, very badly wrong. And if we don't have a socially sustainable environment, things explode. And so both are vital, and it can't just be left to government. That was the message that business was given by Milton Friedman 50 years ago, that business just had to worry with making profits and government would take care of everything else, or markets. And he was unfortunately very badly wrong. We can't leave it to markets. Markets will only regulate a very small proportion of our problems, a valuable proportion, but not enough. And we most certainly can't leave it to governments. Governments are just not strong enough around the world to cope with the present problems. In fact, governments around the world have got a lot weaker than they once were. They're in danger of being overwhelmed by problems. You only have to look at America in the last few months to realize that. So business has to be load-bearing as part of the solution, part of the answer to the problems. And that means it has to be morally load-bearing. And there's no 2 ways about it. That means that the management of business, and especially the senior management, has to be morally load-bearing in terms of both sustainability environmentally and sustainability socially. COVID, which we're all living through still, turns out to have been an amplifier for everything else. And so in the most successful societies on Earth, and in Europe, that means Denmark, COVID was very easily overcome by a combination of business, citizens, and government working together in a moment of collective coming together. Whereas in several other societies, exactly the opposite has happened. COVID has ended up in polarizing people to be even less together than they originally were. So let me drill down and tell you some of the things we now know that Milton Friedman didn't know. And the first thing is that we're a very much better species of mammal, human beings, than Friedman imagined. Friedman bought into a very sort of crude notion of Darwinianism, that people had evolved to be greedy, lazy, and selfish. And that was the Darwinian view of evolution in the 1950s. It's very much not the current understanding of the evolutionary process. And the key intellectual advances here have been by Joe Heinrich, who's head of evolutionary biology at Harvard, and by his counterpart, Nicholas Christakis, who's head of evolutionary biology at Yale. So these are not negligible figures, but what they both show, and they show it in very readable books if you want to find out about it, is that we're very much better than that travesty of greedy, lazy, and selfish. We're actually a very unusual pro-social mammal. We've evolved to work in groups together, to work in teams, to care about each other, and above all, to be willing to sacrifice our own wants in return for others sacrificing their wants. And so we can all together commit to mutually beneficial outcomes. And that's what a very successful society like Denmark did. They came together, everybody agreed to sacrifice their own selfish interest in return for a better overall outcome. And sure enough, that worked remarkably well. And so Danish society will be strengthened the next time some ghastly thing comes along. But the depressing truth is that if we are placed in an organization where we're treated as if we're greedy and lazy and selfish and nothing but that, we're dragged down. We're dragged down to behave like that. And the business community is enormously important because most of our activities take place in our work environments. And those work environments, the way we're treated, that either drags us down to being economic man, greedy, lazy, and selfish, or if we're treated more respectfully, if we're treated in a way that acknowledges our capability to come together and give mutual sacrifices in a team, then we can be raised up. And so very good businesses raise their workforce up, and very bad businesses drag their workforce down. Let me give you an example of a business that was dragged down by treating its own employees very badly. And that was the investment bank Bear Stearns. The younger people in the audience won't have heard of Bear Stearns because it was the first of the investment banks to go bankrupt. Now, the mission statement of Bear Stearns in its lobby entrance was, "We make nothing but money." And so think who was attracted to an organization with that sort of mission. It was people who were attracted by the idea of making money, but not for the business, but for themselves. And they fairly quickly worked out a way of gaming Bear Stearns' very generous incentive system, bonus system. Bear Stearns wanted them to get the deal. And they discovered that the easiest way to get the deal and get the bonus was to enter into deals which were really far too risky for an investment bank to do, but which wouldn't blow up for 3 or 4 years. And so they'd get their bonus, they'd be out of there. And so Bear Stearns went bankrupt because its employees blew it up. If we then take a lot of organizations, business organizations that have endured, the ones that have lasted for a long time, they very largely are based on treating their employees in a very different way. In my little book, The Future of Capitalism, I give an example of that, which is the battle between what started off as the biggest and most profitable company that had ever existed on Earth, which was General Motors. The battle between that and this little Japanese upstart, Toyota, which had no advantages. Toyota was a long way from the American market, and it was trying to break in with no cost advantages, no technology advantages, nothing. And it knew it had only one potential advantage, which is if it could produce high quality cars that were basically fault-free. And so it pioneered a completely different way of making sure that cars were fault-free, which was trust your workforce. In the book, I describe how that was done. It worked. And finally, General Motors' chief executive understood why Toyota was so much more successful. And so he tried to adopt the same idea, trust your workforce. And General Motors discovered they couldn't do it because for 40 years, they'd been treating their workforce as if they were greedy, lazy, and selfish and needed to be scrutinized and incentivized, but not trusted. And so when General Motors tried to make them responsible for quality, it didn't work. And so these are processes which Toyota had raised its employees up over the years. General Motors had dragged its employees down. These are the differences. And now I want to turn to another big mistake that business schools taught. They taught exactly what I've been talking about, that people were greasy, lazy, and selfish, and so needed to be incentivized and monitored. But business schools also had a misconception about the role of a chief executive. They thought that the key thing was to find Mr. really smart, Mr. super smart, who understood how that business world worked better than anybody else. And so he, Mr. Super Smart, would take all the decisions. And then his problem was just how to get these awful, greedy, lazy, selfish people to work. But Mr. Smart turns out not to exist. And the big intellectual revolution of the last 18 months has been the concept of radical uncertainty, which again, Milton Friedman knew about, but recognized was so inconvenient for him that he swept it under the carpet. Radical uncertainty is the proposition that nobody can know enough to understand fully how a complex world works. And so nobody knows what to do. COVID was an obvious example of that. It struck, and initially nobody knew what to do. Now, if you're faced with that situation, and repeatedly business is faced with that situation, the right thing to do is experiment so that you can find out quickly, learn from others, and learn from your own experiments. The more you experiment, the better. And so you want to run experiments in parallel. To do that, a good chief executive needs to set the overall goals of the firm, but then decentralize decision-taking to teams within the firm. And teams then become morally load-bearing. They're given this goal, and the team then struggles and experiments as a team to try and find out. And usually some team will find something that works fairly fast, just as we did with get a vaccine. Right? That was a decentralized decision which worked. Right? And then the real secret of human success kicks in. And the secret of human success is we're really good at copying what works. And so a good chief executive is not the one who has all the answers and pulls the levers of power. A good chief executive is the communicator-in-chief, not the commander-in-chief. The communicator-in-chief sets these goals, which will keep changing as the problems keep changing. The good chief executive then devolves power within the organization to teams, and the teams then rise to the occasion. People work together in teams, as we've evolved to be good at doing, uniquely good at doing. They come up with solutions, and then the good chief executive hoovers those solutions up and shares them. And so it provides an environment in which we can learn from each other. We experiment and we learn. That is the real secret of good leadership. And again, good leaders do it. It's the classic example in the now taught in the business schools is what Johnson & Johnson did some years ago, thanks to a policy that their chief executive had set down, their founding chief executive had set down, called the credo. And the credo, its basic message was that everybody in the organization, their core responsibility was not to shareholders, was not even to the chief executive. Their core responsibility was to the customers who bought Johnson & Johnson's health products. That was the prime responsibility of people. And so they could take decisions for themselves, take big responsibilities for themselves, as Johnson & Johnson employees did. And that produced so many successes that Johnson & Johnson got a really good reputation, and that reputation became extremely valuable. So that's the message that comes from modern research. Business communities enormously important in setting the course of a society. The bulk of our lives are being set by the shape of the business organizations in which we work. A good business organization raises people up, it makes them morally responsible, and they raise themselves to that. Luckily for me, I work in an organization that's exactly like that, Oxford University. Oxford University, we have a vice chancellor who's supposed to be the president of the university, but she'd be the first to admit she doesn't run the university. It's a highly devolved system, but it's one in which we've got a very clear common purpose. We aim to serve a global audience in knowledge, and we aim to do it as well as we possibly can. Hey presto, there was a vaccine that was simple enough that you could produce it anywhere. And so that vaccine is going to be the solution globally to the problem of how do we get vaccines to everybody on Earth. So that's a current real example of a good organization. I hesitate to do it, but let me give you an example of a bad one. and that's Boeing. Boeing used to be a splendid organization, and then it got dragged down by the pursuit of short-term profits. And Boeing realized that to make profits quickly, the best thing to do was to spend a lot of money on lobbying to be able to bypass, in effect, the regulatory process which policed the quality of new planes. And they did a good job. They bought the lobbying which enabled them to bypass what would normally have been the very severe hurdles on the safety of a new plane. But then, very tragically, that new plane started to crash. And it has frankly destroyed Boeing's reputation. I know, because during COVID, the only airlines that have been willing to buy Boeing are the bottom of the market, very cheap cut price airlines. And that will further contaminate Boeing's reputation. And so there was a good company dragged down by the pursuit of short-term profit. It's better if you do what my organization did, trust your workforce. So on that note, Chile, the role model for Latin America, will either raise people up in terms of both environmental sustainability, where there's an awful lot that you can do individually as a firm, an awful lot of things that people can do individually at home, and socially sustainable. And again, Chile, which looked as if it was doing all the right things, then just before COVID, exploded in social anger, just as my own country, Britain, exploded in social anger. And the reason for that had been the neglect of very obviously important social exclusions. Again, your firms can either tackle those social exclusions or ignore them. But if you ignore them, the government won't make it good, nobody else will, and you will be living the consequences. So on that note, thank you very much for inviting me, and have a good conference and actually make a difference to the future of Chile.